Hello and welcome to New Early Music, period compositions and arrangements based on Nordic folk tunes. This is the video version of a conference I gave for the blended intensive program entitled Nordic Manuscripts Project, conceived by the Conservatorio Maderna-Lettimi and partnered by several European academies. The video is intended for the participants who were not able to attend in person, and for anybody online who is curious about Northern European handwritten musical sources from the 1700s and their possible use in modern-day music making. The Nordic Manuscripts Project studies tune collections whose content is a true goldmine for Baroque and folk music practitioners and researchers. These books are the protagonists of my presentation, where I would like to stir reflections around a question that many of the participants to this project might have wondered when presented with the idea of transcribing melodies from old sources, namely, what do we do with them once we have transcribed them? In fact, as you know, the project already provides you with an answer, which is that we arrange them. But then, how do we arrange them? Which arranging style will we use, if any? My goal here is to share possible approaches to those questions, showing examples both from my own production and from other artists' work. Now, a disclaimer before we begin. My presentation is going to be neither purely musicological nor simply practical. It will strike, I hope, a good balance between the two, the artistic side and the research behind it, as is the case in the discipline where I am currently active, the so-called artistic research. My activity in this field started about 10 years ago with my practice-based artistic doctoral project entitled Polska Travels, which focused on composition and arrangement as tools for the hybridization of musical genres, with Nordic folk and Baroque music as points of departure. The first outcomes of that process required a study of old sources of folk music, just like the manuscripts we are working on. In fact, some of the sources I used were the manuscripts we are working on. The tunes I was hunting in those manuscripts were the so-called Polish dances, more specifically, the family of tunes that go under denominations such as polska, polonesses, polonesses, and the likes. Let's discover some of the characteristics of this tune type. The term polska, which means Polish in the Swedish language, refers to a tune type that is generally in tribal time, medium tempo, and danced in couples. As we'll see in a moment, it also displays special rhythmic features. At this point, it is important to note that in the extremely diverse Polska family, the general features I am describing occur in a wide variety of degrees and variations. Different Polskas might display different declinations of these characteristics. Nevertheless, let's see if we can shed light on what makes a Polska what it is. The first aspect we should analyze, since we are dealing with dance music, is rhythm, and to be more exact, the so-called Polish rhythm. The Polish rhythm is a one-bar triple time rhythmic group displaying a decreasing rhythmic condensation. The concentration of rhythmic density at the beginning of a triple time measure is a trademark of polonaise and polonaise-related music, as we can notice also in later repertoire, such as this mazurka by Chopin. The Polish rhythm is the result of a long process that started in the late Renaissance and involved the complex interaction of several factors. One of them is the 16th century practice of the Proportio. In those times, dance sets were often divided in two sections: a walking dance tune in double time, Vortanz in German, and a faster dance in triple time, Nachtanz. Interestingly enough, at least for me, the second tune was often improvised and morphed out of the first one using a proportion that compressed the four subdivisions of the double meter into a 3-beat measure. The proportion acquired different names according to where the rhythmic concentration was placed. As can be seen from the second example, the Polish proportion is the core version of our Polish rhythm. Moving on, it was not infrequent to conclude the set with a third melody, in triple time and usually fast pace. In some sources, it appears under the name of serra. Let's listen to a couple of examples from Danish and Norwegian old tune books. Many serras show similarities with actual Polish folk dances, such as the mazurek, whose rhythm, even with the extreme elasticity that the musicians apply, as we are about to witness, closely resembles the Polish rhythms we are examining. Besides the mazurek, Polish rhythms are also typical in other triple-time Polish folk dances. Therefore, alongside the Proportio practice, and perhaps predating it, we can consider Polish folk music as one of the determining factors in the formation of the rhythmic core in the Baroque Polonaise and the Nordic Polska. Going back to the proportion dance sets, during the 17th century they began to go out of fashion, and their components were collected and notated independently. The second and the third tune, the proportion and the serra, spread all over the central and northern parts of Europe under the name of Polish dances, and probably landed in Sweden thanks to its political and cultural relations with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In fact, the two countries were governed by one king, Sigismund III Vasa, from 1592 to 1599, and his dynasty kept ruling for a good 80 years, exactly in the period when Polish dances became fashionable. It is generally believed that this migration of Polish dances formed part of the ancestry of the Nordic Polska tunes. We can conclude that at the roots of what we nowadays call polska in folk circles and polonaise in art music circles, there is a common heritage that reveals a certain coexistence of quote-unquote village and quote-unquote urban music. This is also reflected in the content of the Nordic manuscripts, where Polish dances and other folk melodies are found side by side with minuets, courantes, gavottes, and other types of Baroque dances. The tune collections from the 17th and 18th century we are examining in this project are known in Sweden as Spelmansböcker, literally the folk musicians' books. These handwritten collections were often compiled by travelers and have traveled themselves from owner to owner, reaching our archives as windows looking into the past of folk, or supposedly folk, music. Their authors were musically educated, since they could evidently write and read music, and were often teaching music in villages where they could also interact with country fiddlers. They enhanced connections between the urban and the countryside environment. The tunes they included, in fact, seemed to relate both to Baroque and to folk style. This suggests that during the 17th and 18th century, there was more intertwining and mutual influence between the two domains than perhaps we might think and experience today. Let's now have a quick peek into how some of these tune books looked like. Here's one of the most popular collections from Sweden, Gustav Blitzström's notebook from 1715. This is another Swedish source, Per Andersson's tune book from 1731. And now, a couple of Finnish examples. This is a small, interesting book compiled by Anna-Katarina Örbom in 1759, where she also provides a composed bass line. To conclude, this is an anonymous source from 1779, preserved at the Sibelius Museum in Turku. In recent decades, the Spelmansböcker have been used by groups to create interesting projects, featuring folk musician researchers who are also familiar with Baroque practice. The Swedish Höök ensemble, for instance, has produced some sort of historically informed arrangements of tunes from Spelmansböcker, such as this one taken from Gustav Blitzström's tune book. Also from Sweden and also from Blitzström's tune book, here is a polonaise performed by the group Silver, with nyckelharpa, fiddle, lute and viola da gamba. In Norway, the flutist and researcher Hans Olav Gorseth has realized a similar project but with Norwegian tune books. Here is a Polish dance taken from Peter Bank's collection from 1779. In Finland, violinist and researcher Pia Kleemola-Välimäki has focused on Samuel Rinta-Nikkola's collection and realized one of the most striking examples of Finnish folk-baroque crossover, joined by Marianna Henriksson on harpsichord and Petri Prauda on bagpipes. Let's listen to their interpretation of the tune Kahmanantin Polska. The artists I showcased mixed Baroque and folk music at two levels. The performance level, that is, the way they play the tunes, and the arrangement level, for instance, writing accompaniments for the tunes while leaving the main melody intact. When I started my doctoral studies and investigated the topics we are talking about, I felt that I wanted to favor the arranging aspect, and eventually found myself drifting closer and closer to actual composition. I thought that if I established the communication between folk and Baroque at the source, so to speak, namely at the level of music writing itself, I could be freer, and it could be a new experiment for me, and well, it could simply be a lot of fun. My two Baroque suites for string orchestra, performed at my first and second doctoral concert, are based on tune I took from Finnish and Swedish old notebooks and folk traditions, clothed with my own Baroque stylization. I will now use a couple of pieces from those suites as case studies. Some movements in the suites are mere arrangements. They leave the body of the melody intact and weave the dress all around it. Some others are proper compositions, using only one or two bars of a polonaise to build an entire movement. This is in fact the concept of new early music, or music that's written in Baroque style, but by a composer who is not dead yet. Composing in a style from the past is of course nothing new. The so-called period composition is the protagonist of an episode released on YouTube by Early Music Sources, which I highly recommend watching. But now we can start with my own example of a period composition, the opening movement from the Finnish suite, devised as a typical Baroque French overture in three parts, with a slow introduction, a lively fugue, and a slow reprise. Let's take a closer look at it. For the slow introduction, I needed a double-time tune with a poised, grave character. Although it did not appear in an old manuscript, I chose a Finnish march known as Mäkeläisen tulomarssi. I took this part, which is about half of the original melody, and dressed it with clearly recognizable French Baroque court clothes, like these dotted rhythms and the fast runs of 30-second notes. Here is the result. For the fugue that followed, I needed a subject, and I found a very good one in a polska, that we have actually already heard. This is once more Kachmanantin Polska. I took the first 4 bars, changed the 3rd and the 4th bar, and there I had my fugue subject. After the first voice has exposed this subject, it passes it to the next entrance, while playing a counter subject. Right from the start, though, I had to face a challenge. I wanted my recontextualization of the polska to retain the rhythmic drive of the original tune. At the same time, however, I wanted to make sure that the Baroque counterpoint was correct and idiomatic. One solution that I used, for example, was writing the counter subject with a concentration of salient rhythmic events on beat 1 and beat 3, like in the so-called Polska heartbeat groove, going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and so on. Anyway, in canonic fugues, after a voice has exposed the subject and the counter subject, it generally launches into a free part that complements what the other voices are playing. Here, I threw in some Polish rhythms, for the reasons I just explained. This is how the second system of the page sounds. The exposition of the fugue concludes with a couple of progressions that use thematic and rhythmic material we have just heard. Everything that follows in this movement is derived from that single little Kachmanantin theme and takes the form of a dialogue between a solo violin and the orchestra. Those 4 bars travel through different variations, textures, tonal areas. As we listen to the following example, you can have fun spotting the Polish rhythms I sprinkled here and there. At this point, the dialogue becomes more intense, with a series of question and answer phrases between solo and orchestra that flows into a progression based on a descending scale with chromatic steps to increase tension. In Baroque rhetorics, chromaticism is a sign that something meaningful is either happening or going to happen. We are, in fact, reaching a climactic point that eventually leads to the end of the fugue, finally flowing into a resting slow section that comes back to the French rhythms. This was my example of a period composition that uses just a few bars of a folk tune as building material. My second case study, instead, shows the arranging approach, which keeps the tune intact but weaves accompaniments that, as we'll see, incorporate several elements that are foreign to the tune itself. The last movement of my Swedish suite features tunes taken from two sources. 3 melodies from Blitzström, followed by one from Per Andersson's notebook and one more from Blitzström. Let's take a close look at the first 2 Blitzström tunes. Do they remind of anything we've talked about so far? As you might have guessed, here we have a great example of a polonaise and its proportion, with an added sarra to conclude the set. Let's hear the tunes in sequence, skipping some of the repeats for the sake of conciseness. These tunes, in my opinion, have something very positive about them. I find them uplifting, energetic, very spring-like. In the whole of this movement, I focused on retaining this character, both with the choice of the tunes and with their arrangement. In fact, I didn't do anything too complicated with the polonaise and the proportion, just small and lively imitations here and there. Let's listen to the only live recording currently available, even if the audio quality is unfortunately not ideal. It is performed by the Hurra Baroque Orchestra, led by Peter Spischki. In the fast, lively sarra that follows, I indulged in a couple of arranging expedients that the tune itself seemed to suggest. Drones and percussive rhythms, tokens of the idealized, simple and raw energy of country life. Countryside ancestry also resonates in the next two tunes. Contradances were indeed very popular Baroque social dances in the 18th century. However, it is believed that their roots lay in English country dances, as the name might suggest. Whatever the etymology, for sure the first contradance that I used displays a very rustic and bouncy character. Let's listen. I introduce these very rhythmic gestures directly towards the end of the preceding sarra, in the second violin and viola part, and then let the tune unfold by itself. After so much energy, the contrastingly more lyrical character of the second contradance offers some space for breath and variety. Furthermore, the B part of the tune consists of a simple melodic sequence that reminds of a pleasantly predictable pop melody, something one would whistle while walking down the road on a sunny spring morning. To underline this nature, I kept the arrangement rather transparent and used quite static harmonies. Also, to make the sound warmer, I entrusted the main tune to the inner voices of the orchestra, namely second violins and violas. Sprinkles of bouncy rhythms then lead us back to another round of the melody, this time with full sound from the whole orchestra. Once more, the B part of the tune becomes a contrasting playground for a gradual increase of energy, with little melodic imitations that culminate in a long ascending cantus firmus theme in the bass. This phrase leads to a reprise of the first contradance, with an energy that gets more and more excited. Let's listen to the full version of these 2 pages. At this point, the village party is full on, and everybody launches into a last dance, which is the B part of the second contradance. The folk melody, the baroque cantus firmus phrase in the bass, the pop-like percussive accompaniment, they all feast together and conclude the movement, and the whole Swedish suite, with the most satisfyingly typical baroque cadence. And now, after this very articulated and energetic set, it is time to pull some threads. The material I shared has probably sparked many questions about the dialogue between different elements in an arrangement or a composition, as is the case of the so-called folk-baroque experiments. But what is that style really? Is it crossover? Is it folk-baroque or baroque folk or anything else? And is it important to give it a name at all? How can we make it coherent and credible? And how is all of this relevant to what we are going to do in our common project? As for me, I personally don't have other answers than the ones I gave myself, and even those are not definitive. For one thing, I have learned that Baroque and folk music are neighboring territories, and like all neighboring territories, they have common grounds, but also differences. A striking, though not so strikingly evident, similarity between folk and Baroque music is that Baroque interpretation is the result of a long process of performance practice, as much as folk interpretation is the result of a long lineage of individuals that nourished a collective knowledge. The transmission might be different, of course, but somehow it seems to me that they both are lines of tradition to which we are trying to reconnect. In a way, then, both the Baroque and the folk practitioner stand on the shoulders of giants from the past. So, having one foot in the past is crucial, but if we want to be credible and honest, especially when we mix the two styles, I think we must take into account another unescapable element, the fact that we are living today. We are human beings of the 21st century, with our embodiment in the present, our sensitivity, our lifestyle, our ideas, our fears, our hopes, in a word, ourselves. We need the knowledge of the past and the awareness of the present, the collective knowledge and the individual voices, the global and the local. My belief is that if this awareness is valued as a centerpiece, the solidity and honesty of the musical blending will therefore be much, much stronger. I now leave you with a list of useful references in case you want to know more about the topics of this presentation. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to write them in the comments or contact me directly. Thanks for watching and listening, and see you next time.